Excellent. All right, I think we might get started. We have quite a lot that we could spend time discussing today, a lot to get through. So firstly, welcome everyone. If I haven't met you before, I think there's a few new names on the call. My name is Emily Morton. I'm the Standards and Code Lead here at ACFID, and working with my colleagues, Whitney, who's on the line as well, and Paul Brunton in the code team. And I'd like to also introduce Julianne and Andrew, who are both here today to help facilitate this conversation. They're with the Social Economy Group and most of you might have come across them in some of the consultations so far, but they've been supporting us with this code review process. I'm very grateful for that. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining today from the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people here in Canberra, and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I'd like to pay my respects as well to any other Indigenous or First Nations people who are joining today. And I welcome you to put your own acknowledgement in the chat or share where you're joining from today as well. It's always nice to hear people joining from all over Australia, and sometimes the world too. So please feel free to do that. So before I hand over to Julianne and Andrew for today's discussion, I just wanted to say a big thanks to everyone who has participated so far in either the consultations as part of the code review, or you might have contributed to your organisation's written submissions through the online survey and responding to some of those kind of bigger questions about the code. I guess we're still kind of in the early stages of the review, but we're very much relying on your experiences with the code, your feedback to guide what those next steps are. So we really appreciate the time that you're taking to sort of be involved in this. And I'm sure as we get into the sort of nitty-gritty and the potential changes to wording and everything, people tend to get engaged as well at that stage. So thank you for starting out on this journey with us as we work towards some potential changes to the code as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about next steps at the end, but just to set the scene a little bit for us today, we are now coming sort of to the end of the initial consultation round, which talked and looked at some of those bigger questions in the discussion paper. And Julianne and Andrew will just share a little bit in a moment about who we've been talking to and what we've heard as well. But just to say that we're now in the process of sort of collating, digesting, working our way through all of that feedback, pulling out some of the themes that we're hearing, recurring quite often, some of the specific recommendations that members have given us as well. So we're now sort of moving from the big picture down to the specifics of, okay, well, what have we heard and what actually needs to change in the code, if anything. So the next steps and this conversation today is the start of that next process of starting to test some of our thinking around what we've heard and what those next steps might be as well. So there will be more opportunity as we move and as we start actually developing and writing up any changes to the code for you to be involved as well. So this is by no means the last step in this process, but we really appreciate and welcome your initial feedback today, and any thoughts after today's session as well. Please feel free to always get in contact with us, but we'll talk a bit more about that at the end. All right, I might hand it over to Julianne and Andrew now to kick off the session. Over to you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Emily. I'll just get to sharing our presentation here also. So everyone, I'm Julianne Rose. I'm a director of the Social Economy Group. We're a consultancy that works exclusively with not-for-profits. We've been pleased to be able to walk alongside both ACFID and members in this review of the code. As Emily just outlined, this is really our first chance to share back to members here's what we've heard, here's the messages that are clear that we've heard from members, here are those where We've fairly quickly been able to come up with some principles or propositions in response to some of those messages, and some of those areas where we've heard feedback, there's something that may need further investigation, but we haven't yet been able to undertake that piece of work. As we step through the presentation today, which many of you may have already seen from pre-distribution for the most part, what would be helpful for us is knowing that this is one of the first ways in which we're consolidating this feedback. Ask us questions if things aren't clear, if how we're representing the feedback isn't clear, if the connection between the feedback or the recommendation isn't clear, because as well as simply you getting visibility of the consultation, this is absolutely a chance for us to be able to keep refining this and as quickly as possible, getting to clarity as to what those next steps might be. While Emily's already given some overview of the start of the process, just to a recap, particularly for those of you who may not have been directly involved in prior consultation sessions, the formal stage of consultation commenced through the distribution of a discussion paper that was split into two main sections. One that talked generally about the structure, function, form, and purpose of the code. Is it achieving its objectives? Are there areas of duplication, areas that need to be streamlined? Is it integrating well with other standards and regulations that members are either required to or opting to align with? And the second section of the discussion paper spoke about emerging issues in international development and humanitarian response. And the three that were particularly highlighted were those around climate change, locally led development and humanitarian action, and diversity, anti-racism, and racial justice. There were a set of design principles for the review. So largely saying that the structure and architecture of the code holds, so changes are within that rather than changing that architecture, and that the goal is to take things that are required, what ensures that the code is achieving good practice, what is no longer aligned with other requirements that members are facing, those types of needs, not simply preference changes. We've had a great volume of participation from across members. So the primary way in which people have engaged has been through online consultation sessions. One of those was made open to all members to join from whichever focal area, location. And while we had thought of running in-person sessions, certainly the virtual forum was far more popular for people to sign up to. And the rest were largely organised around the communities of practice or groups such as the Code of Conduct Committee, which has specific accountabilities for the code, and the Development Practice Committee. We also did hold an in-person session with the ACFID board, therefore including obviously also CEOs of a number of member agencies, but also who have a particular governance accountability for the code. In the written responses to the discussion paper, there were 18 commenced attempts at completing the survey, but beyond writing unknown or don't know, there were 14 that were actually substantively completed survey responses. And as you can see there, that was a bit of a bell curve where 2 were large agencies, 6 were medium and 2 were small. And we've received 3 full written submissions from agencies, 2 large, 1 medium. So while we're still looking to try and map from across those communities of practice what proportion of the membership have participated, there's certainly been a diversity of the membership that has joined in throughout the process to date. Oops, I'm getting a little carried away with my buttons here. So what have we heard? When asking people, do you think there is a need for the code to change? There wasn't a significant appetite. The response was almost a not really. But as we asked a couple more questions, actually there was very quickly a momentum and alignment around some key areas of feedback. While people didn't want to fundamentally change the code, people certainly weren't looking for additional requirements, there was, irrespective of agency size, a request that the code can be simplified. And that's meant a variety of things. That can be clarification of some language. Some people have asked for some terms to be more clearly defined. Some of it's been within the code where, for example, some verifiers, the evidence you need to produce, may seem very similar. Can those things be consolidated so you have to produce one thing once rather than two very similar things in separate locations? Sometimes that's been while there's only half of member agencies that may also participate in ANCP, the fact that there are substantively the same requirement, but for a couple of wording changes, at least half of members are being required to do slightly different forms of response. And bringing those closer together wouldn't impose any additional burden on those that aren't participating in ANCP, but it would simplify it for the half of members who are participating in ANCP. There was feedback around some areas where it was felt that the commitment or the verifier was too prescriptive on the exact way in which something was required to be met, rather than allowing for some innovation, management discernment, individual organisations to be able to design the approach of best fit. And so allowing some more, and sometimes it may be reducing or removing a verifier, but in some times it may be simply adjusting the parameters of that verifier to give some more freedom in how agencies demonstrate the same commitment. The compliance burden overall was a comment from everybody, from the largest to the smallest of members, but there certainly did seem to be a specific burden carried by smaller members, particularly in significantly volunteer staffed and volunteer governed organisations. And another piece where, while there was the thematic exploration of what locally led development and humanitarian practice would look like, that feedback also came through extensively within the generalised section, that a number of the requirements in how agencies are expected to work and which requirements they're expected to cascade down to in-country partners are inadvertently reinforcing the power imbalance of being in a global north country and often in a position of acting as at least an intermediary donor to other partners. It was reinforcing that rather than moving away from that. So while it was in the general comments, it was certainly aligned with momentum around localization as the driver in that way. We've got the summaries, which you will have seen, of kind of the questions that were asked and what the core pieces of feedback were that we heard. So members certainly affirmed that the code broadly, while there were some specifics to improve, but it does reflect current understanding of good practice. It's still meeting its relevance, and it's still described what people feel sets a benchmark for the sector. And there are a range of ways people articulated that value. It helps internally to keep people aligned on process and reaffirm the priority of particular behaviours. It has an external audience to particular donors, partners, so that there was a sense of value ascribed to the code. I mentioned in the summary of the most dominant pieces of feedback that the need of reviewing what is being cascaded to in-country partners was certainly one of the areas of greatest proposition for change. The flexibility, as mentioned, but also recognising the value of some of the existing flexibility, knowing that there are some organisations, for example, that aren't part of humanitarian response. There are some organisations that are particularly child-focused and others that don't engage children directly at all. So the fact that the code currently already provides some carve-outs for where members may be more or less engaged in some activities, while there was a sense it should remain relevant to all members, that existing flexibility remains important. There was one proposition that came through from a couple of responses. So while it wasn't a dominant piece of feedback, to challenge that question of whether being relevant to all members required being the same for all members. That whether particularly as a more potentially diverse a range of organisations have joined over the years, and given the huge breadth of size differences between members, whether it's reasonable to say that the code should apply evenly to all, even with the caveats of sort of commensurate with your size, or whether in fact that actually restricts a level of ambition on larger members, for example, who people might say you could otherwise reasonably expect to perform at a higher again standard of practice. So there were at least a couple of clearly articulated asks to consider what that may mean. As to the document itself and its coherence and its usability, you see here the feedback around ensuring clearer definitions, just simplifying the number of documents and publications that the code is made up on, so it's easier to find what you need, that you're not having to reference multiple documents, making sure that everything can be downloaded as a PDF, making sure that everything is available in a form that's also accessible, for example, for e-readers or people who may need larger font or particular color contrast, ensuring that verifiers are not asking for duplication of information that members are already having to provide elsewhere. And Andrew will give some more specific examples of that a little later. I guess in overarching sense, so on some of the other areas of the code where effort meeting and implementing requirements is disproportionate, there was a sense that in some areas the code is seeking to avoid risk, as opposed to recognising that some of the work that our agencies undertake is inherently involving of risk, and it's around the effective decision-making around the appropriate level of risk and the management of that risk, rather than avoidance of risk. And there was also the highlight that a large amount of the compliance burden comes from the process itself. So it may not be the principle that we're committed to, the commitment that we're making, but sometimes the way in which we are asked to provide information, or the way in which we're required to provide our evidence of our verifiers, or even the questions of are there too many or too few words required to be able to respond, how those processes can make it harder as well. And this section continued to have ongoing reference to what the impacts are on local partners. The process for upholding code signatory status, there was a sense that while the code remains a self-assessed and voluntary code, that the mechanisms are robust and give assurance that members are upholding the code. There was a recommendation around whether there could be increased transparency of compliance with the code. And for clarity, that wasn't necessarily a by individual agency listing of that, but instead looking at, as a sector, what proportion of the sector has been able to demonstrate a particular area. Are there areas where we're seeing improved practice? What are some of the focal areas where we know it's currently a challenge, and helping fulfill the goal of transparency of the code itself by increasing openness around that information. One query that came through from one respondent in terms of do we have the certainty and assurance of upholding the code was whether financial reports across members are aligning with the code. And simply on a process and administrative side, exploring the feasibility of quicker turnaround times on the assessments and exception reporting. Certainly an area of significant feedback, and I'll hand over shortly to Andrew to speak to this in some more detail, has been around the relationship with other standards and regulations. The most dominant area of feedback in every form of the consultation process was around the intersection, the overlap, and the both similarity but also difference in purpose between what the ACFID Code can fulfill versus what DFAT accreditation fulfills. So I guess to reiterate my earlier point, it is absolutely recognised that half of ACFID members are not DFAT accredited, and so we need to be cautious to not unduly bring requirements onto those members that wouldn't otherwise apply, but with that caveat, to work out what else can be done to ease the burden of the misalignment between those two. I'm just going to flick a couple of slides ahead, Andrew, to foreshadow some of the other non-DFAT regulations that people have, or standards that people have given feedback on. The ACNC, both the process for eligibility for charitable status, the governance standards, but also the external conduct standards. So there was a sense of opportunity across almost all of the elements of ACNC regulation, particularly given that many of them have obviously come into place since elements of the code were either first developed or most recently revised. The core humanitarian standards were the next most referenced, and probably the most specific item that people referred to was seeking to draw upon what's been developed through the safeguarding index under the core humanitarian standards. Particularly when it came to comments in relation to climate, because there are, the Australian government is foreshadowing where there may be future legislation around reporting and disclosures based on ESG principles, and therefore that may become an external requirement. And given that some members are voluntarily looking at how they start ESG reporting and disclosure in line with those principles, how can we stay where we are doing similar work? How do we align with that? However, that was certainly a comment that related more to examples of good practice rather than recommending new commitments or new verifiers. And then the last 5 items listed here were only mentioned by 1 or 2 respondents across the consultations, but across the Fundraising Institute of Australia, the requirements under the humanitarian program, the Australian National Principles for Child Safe Organisations, the Modern Slavery Act, although the mandatory reporting under the Modern Slavery Act applies to very few ACFID members, given it kicks in at 100 organisations or companies of $100 million and more, and reference to the ISO standard in relation to bribery. So these are areas where, in most cases, members haven't proposed a specific change. They have referenced these standards and regulations, and there's work still to be done for us to complete some of the mapping or the possibility of what would it be to align more closely with these. I'll therefore hand to Andrew at this point to tell us a little bit more about, firstly, the intersection between the ACFID Code and DFAT accreditation, and then speak more generally to, across this feedback that we've heard in the first section of how to generally streamline the code, what are some principles for how we can choose from that, what might be appropriate changes, and some examples to work through to illustrate those. But certainly if there's either questions on the feedback so far, please feel free to put those in the chat, and we'll make sure that we've got a chance to respond to those either during or following Andrew's discussion. Thanks, Andrew.
So people will remember a little while ago there was a mapping done between the code and DFAT accreditation, and we have significantly drawn upon that in seeking to identify ways of responding to the feedback around the alignment between the two. And so you can see here there's kind of different categories that we have been thinking about where there is alignment. Okay, so that there, you can see at the bottom of the first column, there's a bunch of things where they're basically almost completely aligned, or you know, in the case of the code, it is exceeding what DFAT has required. So in terms of amending the code, there's not a lot that we can do there other than a little bit of making it slightly easier. You know, for example, there's a question in DFAT accreditation that is in fact 2 verifiers and two compliance indicators in the code. Well, you could pull those together and that make it slightly easier, that kind of thing. But that really relies on a willingness of DFAT to give some recognition to those things. Then there's places where it's reasonably close, and it's probably not a huge imperative for DFAT in its due diligence, because we've looked at what they're requiring in terms of due diligence. So there's a piece around strategic planning. There's a lot about the engagement of primary stakeholders, which are virtually aligned. And so if you did some changes, that they could sort of fall into that category down the bottom. And then there's some where it's like, okay, there's some room for closer alignment. You know, child protection is very close to aligned. Safeguarding probably not quite, or financial wrongdoing not quite as aligned. But it's unlikely that driving closer and closer alignment is going to lead DFAT to say, oh, well, we're happy to rely, you know, on what you've said in relation to the code. That's going to be something they want to test for themselves. So there's potential greater alignment that can be created, but we need to be realistic about how much driving greater alignment is going to assist those that are DFAT accredited, and also recognize that with half not DFAT accredited, we don't want to unnecessarily increase a burden to have them comply with something which really doesn't actually deliver the benefits of DFAT accreditation. Okay. The other thing that we would observe is that there are, as we looked across, there's much greater focus in both ACNC and DFAT on enterprise-wide risk, and we would say that that's not much of a focus of the code. It's focused more on program and project risk, or specific risks associated with specific areas, child protection, PSEAH, finance, that kind of thing. We also note that there's greater requirements in relation to monitoring and evaluation that, say, are reflected in Quality Principle 4, and other policies that go even beyond accreditation, like the climate action strategy. So as we looked at that alignment, as we thought about what was realistic, as we thought about what was in control of a review of the code, as opposed to something, you know, in some other process related to accreditation, that's where we landed on the principles that we'd like to just share with you, provide you some examples on, and get any insights or feedback that you have. You want to flick through to that one, Julianne? Yep, I can't do anything about that. Yep, keep going. So we've got the 7 principles that we came up with, and just want to work through those, and just get some feedback as we move through. So the first one is to consolidate compliance indicators or verifiers that appear in multiple places, to remove duplication, and where necessary cross-reference. Okay, you've dealt with that up there. So yes, we've still got, say, a compliance indicator down here, but the verifier is just the same as the one up there. So one of the examples of this in terms of duplication is that in 2.5.3, which only relates to child-focused organizations, it talks about child-friendly complaint mechanisms. I have got the number around the wrong way. It's 1.4.3, not 1.3.4. But up in 1.4 in child safeguarding, there is in fact a requirement there that you have accessible complaints mechanisms to all, including children. So that was a kind of a space that we could see that there was some room for some consolidation, and so that's the sort of thing that we're thinking about there. Any thoughts or questions in relation to that one before we move to the next principle? No? Excellent. So we'll jump to the next one. Click next, Julianne. There we go. This is to make sure she's still awake. So there was also some indicators, and while these may not be considered hugely burdensome, there are some indicators which actually do apply to all ACFID members, say under the ACNC reporting requirements. So for example, one of the verifiers is that you have your governing document on your website. Well, you're all required to have your governing document submitted to the ACNC and on their website. So we thought that that was a place for alignment. Similarly, in relation to audited financial statements, there's requirements there. So this was a place where, okay, there's something that's kind of applies to everybody. So that would be a way that you could just say, okay, we either remove that or we say the verifier is you're reporting the ACNCs up to date. So that's the suggestion for that second one. Any questions on that one or any comments? No, these ones are fairly straightforward. The third one is to align external regulation with two criteria. The regulation is settled, it's been in place for a while, doesn't look like it's likely to significantly change, and when the code is already substantially meeting those requirements. So the best two examples of this are the 9 minimum standards for child protection. There is, extensive overlap with the code in relation to that. There's probably some few places where you could drive some greater alignment in language, so it was clearer exactly how they align. And exactly the same with the external conduct standards. Many of you will be familiar with the mapping that already exists between those, but we do think there's space to kind of strengthen the language that shows greater levels of alignment. And we think that they're two places where regulation is reasonably settled at the moment. The reason we put this principle around reasonably settled is you don't want a scenario where you're sort of aligning with something which has the potential to keep sort of iterating and changing. And so you're always chasing the alignment with the external regulation. But these have been in place for a while and seem reasonably settled. So any questions or thoughts or comments around that principle? No, we'll keep bouncing along. So the next one is, this is particularly relates to DFAT accreditation and relates to a thing that I said before. Seek to align DFAT accreditation requirements where there's a reasonable prospect of some type of recognition by DFAT accreditation in relation to those. You don't want to get down a path where you try and drive alignment and it's like, well, it doesn't matter how much you align, that's not going to actually reduce the compliance burden, either through being able to say copy and paste answers across, or say have something that's determined to no longer be a priority for DFAT accreditation, say because that's already handled in the code and the code is a precondition for accreditation. So one of the examples here is those, you've got the requirements in 4.1 around strategic plans. There's an indicator in DFAT accreditation, A1.5, which is about strategic plans. It's not something that's fundamental to DFAT's due diligence requirement. So if we could drive some greater alignment there, that might provide us some scope to say, right, is that something that, say, could be removed from accreditation when it's next reviewed. But these are things that you would want to explore before you went ahead and did them. But that's kind of the proposition for Principle 4. Any questions about that? So once we got to this point, we were really talking about things where there was still a reasonable gap between the external requirement, the regulatory requirements, which apply to some or all of ACFID's members, and what appears in the code. So we were left with saying, okay, well, would you do it just for one thing? We went, no, probably not. If there's still a substantial gap, you're just pulling in an external burden and then applying it across the entire cohort. But there are some things where we've seen there's multiple requirements, for example, DFAT accreditation in the ACNC. So the point I made before around enterprise risk in different ways, that is part of external conduct standard 1, it does bleed into other of the external conduct standard, but that's the most obvious place. And the whole criterion A2 in relation to enterprise risk management. So we thought there is potential to try and create some kind of alignment. It may not be full alignment, some kind of alignment which kind of picks up, this is a direction external regulation is going. That contrasts with 6, where it's like, okay, if there's just one and there's still, a substantial gap between the level of prescription and expectation that exists, well, there may be a case for strengthening it, as a reflection of good practice, but not seeking to fully align. It would help people, but not just complete and full alignment was our suggestion there. And so, the financial wrongdoing, it does appear in 8.2.1. There's reference to fraud and other financial wrongdoing. It's nowhere near as extensive as what appears in, say, E3, for example, in DFAT accreditation. And so you wouldn't seek to go the whole distance there, but you would seek to strengthen that. The language around that potentially just makes some things more explicit. And then the final principle on the previous slide was you may look across some of these and you go, oh, that strategic planning one, that's not that different. One of the examples is often in relation to communications, and requirements around there. How much difference does that really make? That's not really where, say, these external regulators are focused. But we recognized and we heard from people, it is the cumulative burden of these things, where if you can get any little gains in terms of alignment or cross-recognition or simplification of the rules, that whole idea of, okay, if I'm sending it to the ACNC and it's on the website and everyone can see it, why do I have to keep sending it to all of these other people? That there was a benefit to that into the cumulative value. And communications is kind of the best example of this. It continues to surprise me that, for example, you need that whole section in D2 in accreditation where it is fully and completely aligned with what your requirements are under the code. Okay. So that's kind of the principles we're proposing. That tries to give you some examples of what we're talking about. We kind of give you a shape of, this is how we're thinking about seeking to respond to the feedback around, alignment and compliance and simplification and all of that. What you can see from that is while the principle we were given was necessity, not convenience for change, if you're going to drive that kind of simplicity and alignment, there may, in fact, be a lot of little changes just to try that are scattered across the code to try and achieve that alignment. And this is the principles that we're proposing to use to inform and shape that piece of work.
Before we head on to the second part of the discussion paper, which goes more to specific questions of development practice, as Andrew's just kind of concluded there, nearly all respondents spoke about simplification, but it can never be a change that's just going to be to one indicator or one commitment or one verifier. It is, as he summarized, these lots of micro changes. And to do that, we have to give ourselves some set of rules as to where we would or wouldn't do that. So I would be interested in pausing for a moment just to get your reflections on what we've heard. What we've heard is the standards are about right. Please don't impose new obligations on us. But the standards are about right. Don't water down the commitments that we're making. But can you make it easier for us to do our jobs? And can you enable us to do it in a way where we kind of prove each thing only once, if we can possibly do so? And also the piece that we haven't probably gone into quite as much here from the feedback, it's a slightly different construct from the principles, but is the please also consider what this means for our relationship and partnership and feasibility with local partners. So whether people have comments as to whether that resonates with what they thought them as an individual or your organisation has been trying to communicate, or is there anything that seems like a surprise, or you're uncertain of why we might have heard the feedback that we have? Feel free to just take yourself off mute and wave a hand or use the chat box.
Hi, Julianne. Sorry, I'll just jump in, but I don't have any surprises, and that's the thing. I think they're all unsurprising.
Which at the moment I think will take as a win.
Yeah.
And look, certainly this was the simplification. Yes, there was an element to which those members who are participants in ANCP and therefore do face DFAT accreditation, to some extent were the most vocal on where some pain points were. But that was also shared by a number of the smaller agencies who said, well, actually, they find some of those sections just as burdensome. And while there were then also other questions of where, you know, some of those comments around where definitions could be clarified, what kind of commensurate with your scale means could be clarified, how to bring those examples of good practice and the different resources together. So if you're just getting started to pursue accreditation for the first, sorry, not accreditation, to pursue ACFID membership and demonstrating compliance with the code for the first time, what makes that process easier? For many of these things, it is the reality that that regulation already applies, or what is understood to be good practices remaining consistent. If we can make it easier for anyone, we're making it easier in some ways for everyone. And the only piece where we're perhaps less certain on the where we're still having to test is because we received few member comments that gave a specific proposition to say, please change this compliance indicator, or please change this verifier. It is now in part us as external advisors coming up with identifying some of those pieces. Now, we will not be the decision makers, and towards the end of the session, ACFID will give an overview of what the sort of the next steps are, where things relate to particular COPs. They will be available as an input to helping shape some of those. But I guess us wanting to make sure that it was clear that while people overall said, look, we think that the code itself fundamentally doesn't need to change, and we understand the design principle is by necessity. If you were going to mark up these things and track changes, it would look like a lot of things had changed, even though it's really in some ways a housekeeping type activity is the main piece of feedback. Again, setting aside that localization comment I made. Any responses from anyone else, either in terms of surprises or things that that you're uncertain about from this first section? That looks like silence. We'll flick over then to section 2. Now I've got to make sure I share the right screen again. Give me just 1 second to not get that wrong. There we go. So as we outlined, there were 3 main themes, or what was framed as emerging issues within the discussion paper, which have come about from specific member request, sector discussions, global development sector momentum. And one of the things that we used there was certainly there was one particular respondent who queried why these items, that they'd felt that they'd come about from particular advocacy or particular subsections of the membership that may have advocated for some of these more or less than others. But actually across the responses we received, each of these three areas had the same proportion of members indicating that either between very important or somewhat important, that these areas had relevance to their strategy over the next kind of strategic horizon. So they may not all be equally important to all members, but there was certainly an equal amount of importance for each of these issues once looking across the membership. That said, while members spoke about all three as being relevant, all three being strategically important, the number one area of these in terms of the volume of comment and the specificity of feedback and the breadth of components of the code where we receive feedback on was in relation to localization, what locally led development and humanitarian action look like. And interestingly, for the diversity, anti-racism and racial justice recommendations, while some of those related I guess to in Australia activities, are our organisations inclusive? Are our management, leadership, governance positions representative of both the organisation but also the community within which we're located or the community that we're focusing on working with? A significant proportion of the recommendations from diversity, anti-racism and racial justice definitely overlapped with those of localization. Those two themes, apart from that in Australian governance and inclusion piece, really did integrate as to a common set of feedback and recommendations. And climate change probably came next. So locally led had the highest number of comments, climate change had the next highest number of comments, and diversity, anti-racism and racial justice came third by volume, but significantly intersected with localization. I'll flick back to Andrew in terms of the, what some of our rationale was, therefore, as to how we've heard feedback from the section, again, giving ourselves a principle for responding to feedback here.
So as we explored with people, how to approach the three themes, having had them basically affirmed as, yes, these are the three emerging themes that with the varying degrees of urgency in relation to them, we had a discussion. So how would you integrate them? Now there were a small number of people who thought there were some that may have required whole new quality principles, but by and large, what people were able to identify was that in many instances, these were extensions of, adaptions of, or reframings of existing principles or commitments or compliance indicators or good practice indicators that already existed within the code. So take climate change, there's a space around environmental stewardship and sustainability, and there was a sense in which extension into explicitly identifying climate change as a significant threat was a place to do that. Or down in the annual reporting, the expectations in relation to that. There could be some, for example, a good practice indicator there, or that kind of thing. When it came to locally led development, there was a range of different places, but it was seen as fundamentally reframing of what was already there. So that's not to say there wouldn't, for example, be maybe one additional commitment in some places, or an additional compliance indicator, but fundamentally there was a location that could be identified for each of the three themes, all locations within the existing framework of the code.
And certainly that there was a very significant push throughout feedback of don't add more on. So while each of these were important, to some extent it was, what does this mean for the evolution of our good practice, rather than these are more an additional in order for us to be able to demonstrate good practice. And I've accidentally flicked a little too far. No, I haven't. I'll leave with you, Andrew, for climate change before I come back in on localization.
Sorry, can I ask a question before you?
Yeah.
So what that shows, I think, is that when the code was put together, it was in some sense looking forward to new things that agencies need to be considering, and that the code is actually highly relevant and pushing agencies and members into areas that we consider are going to be relevant in the future.
And Phil, that piece of feedback was actually explicitly made in a couple of the consultation sessions by others, where it was, you know, in some ways, particularly for people who may not have been involved in some of the earlier stages of code development, it can feel like a compliance burden. But the origin and the intent of the code was, this is voluntary. This is the sector coming together to define what good practice means to ourselves. And it is intended to be learning and evolving and stretching us. So there were certainly comments around, how do we ensure the code continues to set a level of ambition, that it isn't just a kind of lowest common denominator, avoid worst risk tick box. There were certainly comments around, so the principle earlier around retaining the architecture of the code, there really is a progression that says there's good practice guidance that gives you a hint as to what the emerging future might be, or what the next highest standard is you could be aspiring to. It's not relevant for everyone. Not everyone has the means. Not everyone's at that level of their organisation maturity. There are a range of reasons why those good practice indicators may not be, some of them may not ever be relevant to all members, but there is that sense of things evolving where something may start as some people do it, that then gets recognised and communicated as good practice. And over time, that may become the norm and gets established as a commitment or a verifier level. And something new gets documented as emerging good practice. So that historical intent that the code served that purpose, and the retention of the architecture to make explicit that purpose, has absolutely been reinforced by others through this process as well.
So in the consultations, were there any, I know that they're the three key emerging issues, but were there any other issues that were put up or thought of that maybe those push areas that will stretch us, and or were they really all around those three key ones that you've
in terms of development practice, those three were the three that were reinforced. On the screen are other things people hadn't found a home for across the consultation of, effectively, can you please think about these things? Or it's not that the code is silent on these things, but, you know, regulations changing, or the ATO's looking at this in more detail, or the ACNC's looking at this in more detail. Could you please give us some greater clarity on some of these things? But as you'll see, a lot of these relate more to the Australian entity practice, as opposed to necessarily development practice. The one other area that came through, I guess, was the reflection back at the point that all the changes were implemented for the PSEAH components in the last round of changes to the code. There was a sense of both learning as to what went well as code changes were made, and what helped enable members to respond to that, that could be useful in any changes emerging from this. But there was also that chance to reflect back and say, okay, now that we've been doing this for a couple of years, what's working well? What do we like about what the code does relevant to some other, in comparison to some other standards? What can we learn, for example? So as people have referenced the core humanitarian standard index that's being compiled, oh, that's useful. You know, now that that exists, what can we do to learn from that? So safeguarding came through not as a, not necessarily that what's good practice has changed. People have become more experienced and have more learning, and have seen other people find new ways of structuring and reflecting upon that. That would have been the other main practice area that came through more strongly. And maybe the only other, I'm just trying to think of any other sort of like little snippet comments. There was probably a question of, this was only one respondent that I can think of making this comment, given some of the origins of the code at its start and the agencies that were around and participating at the time, despite the reviews and evolution of the code since, does it still hold a particular INGO model at its core? And if so, does that inhibit different types of emergent, innovative, niche development practice that doesn't fit that model? So almost, part of this consultation has been all of those responses have been within ACFID's current membership. So organisations that have managed to fit the model, who's excluded, and is that a source of some of that new practice, was one other question that got asked, but without a specific answer or examples being provided.
Whitney's just noted that the kind of tech and social media, it kind of cropped up in different ways, but probably as you explored it, it was more about, well, how does the new technology relate to the existing commitments within the code, and how they might be explicitly engaged.
And sorry, I'll add one more supplement onto that. I think also the in supporting the capacity or in assisting in kind of where risk lies in partnerships with local partners, I think the questions of, as local partners are increasingly engaging in use of social media in different ways, or, in countries where cryptocurrency is increasingly being utilized or people are hearing of it being utilized, kind of simply we're all in this together. Australian NGOs haven't resolved all these issues. Local partners haven't resolved all of these issues. How might this play out in our partnerships? And are there differences we need to consider as to how those things might look in the two contexts? But again, it was raised as a, it's interesting and there might be something in it. It certainly wasn't something that yet came with a particular piece of feedback or a particular proposition at this stage.
So anyone to talk about climate change, Julianne?
Yep, over to you for climate change.
Yeah. So as you can see in relation to the feedback, it's currently seen as somewhat incentivizing support of climate action and doesn't prevent or hinder action. As you can see, there's some uncertainty about the need for changes to the code, but there were a number of specific suggestions that emerged out. When we asked people, we sort of talked in terms of those kind of three domains of the climate action framework, namely the programming of members, the operations of members, and the policy and advocacy of members. And people really kind of organized their thinking around the programming and the operations of the organization. And so there was identification of, different legislative contexts or reporting requirements or so on. There were some people who said, oh, well, we don't really do climate change programming, so it's not relevant to us. And then there were others who said, well, whatever it is that you're doing, climate change is such a big issue. It will impact on you in some way. And so as we tried to work our way through and listen to the feedback, we came up with these collection of relatively modest propositions. The first is one I spoke about earlier around adding specific reference to commitment 3.3 around environmental stewardship and sustainability. And that kind of picks up the kind of programming aspect without necessarily including a significant new amount of burden in relation to it. The second suggestion was that we thought, was a way of incorporating these. There's quite a lot of discussion of the contextual analysis impacting on programming and in seeking to sort of pick up that, well, climate change is going to impact all the programming we're doing, some kind of suggestion of a reference there. And then there's a bunch of things in relation to reporting. And so thinking about how some kind of expectation around the reporting of members in relation to, their mitigating their contribution in their operations and so on was identified as a possible way forward, recognising there's currently a good practice indicator in relation to that. One of the challenges in relation to that is obviously it's a kind of context that's in flux. There's sort of changes, to reporting in the legislative context. So how you could put that in a way that would apply to all members. And then in relation to the good practice indicators, there was a number of areas identifying how you could make reference to other existing reporting or good practice guides that you can see there. So that was kind of the approach to try and kind of identify, well, if people think that this is something that could be strengthened, what's the way that could do it in such a way that applies to all members and kind of recognises the context.
And this was certainly an area where smaller members certainly felt that they were least ready to be able to respond to anything that imposed a new specific obligation on particularly organisational requirements, operational requirements, rather than programmatic. And that was something that came with kind of either cost or technical expertise that only larger members might be in a position to respond to. However, also potentially the challenge that larger members may be more likely to undertake more operational activities with more carbon impact at the same time. So there was a sense that apart from, as Andrew outlined, making explicit that the sector recognises that if you're considering environmental stewardship, that has to include climate. And if you're considering risks to your programs, you should be thinking about climate as one of, if you're ensuring sustainability of your programs and you're sure you're being responsive to the local context, climate is one of the things that needs to be referenced. Kind of to the point, Phil, that you made previously. In the rest, it was how do we prepare the membership for the direction where this is likely to become increasingly an obligation? How do we signpost what good practice looks like? And how do we help members get to at least, outside of the code through information or resources or training or whatever else might be possible, understanding some of those first steps in baselining, or understanding some of those what might be some of the monitoring that you might be able to do internally, or things that you might want to track for your operational piece. But overall, beyond those first couple of propositions, the intent on climate is that most is incorporated as good practice guidance, but likely to progress as the legislative and regulatory environment around membership changes, that may then progress in future to being requirements. Given that while the localization and anti-racism components have a large level of intersection, this one kind of stands on its own. So similarly, I might just pause here for a moment in case there are any other questions specific to climate that people wanted to highlight at this point. Can't see anything in chat and can't see anyone unmuting. Please do feel free if there's either affirmation or questions or concern, no matter which aspect of feedback, feel free to add those in. To therefore flick over to the locally led development and humanitarian action. This is the area where there was the most consistent feedback, and actually contrary to some of the other changes, this is where small members felt that any change would have the least impact on them. More small members felt that this was already the innate way in which their organisations operated, and they felt that the change was more significant for larger entities, particularly those that are members of either global federations or global confederations, where it may be a more significant change to their ways of working. But that said, despite the large number of participants in the consultation process who were large and medium, even if that is true, certainly they were all just as vocal on the need for this to be a key area of change. What came through most strongly in this was well, actually, there were a few themes of what came through strongly. One was simply language within her, simply. They're always the hardest changes to negotiate. The language of the code, where some language no longer conveys what would be seen as an appropriate meaning. The word empowerment as implying that it is the global north agency of the Australian NGO that is enabling the power of the local partner rather than recognising the power of the local partner. The sense of the ANGO enabling participation or seeking participation or referring to people as primary stakeholders, when actually it's those people's lives, those people's communities, those people's organisation. It's us who are coming along to participate from Australia, rather than those people and communities being our stakeholders. So there are certainly areas where philosophy, framing and language is being asked to be changed. As Andrew alluded to near the start of the session, quality principle 2, which is entitled Participation, Empowerment and Local Ownership, is one of the key areas which not only triggers some of those language changes, but also has more substantive change, as indicated in the second bullet point to the right here, around some of the commitments, indicators and verifiers. Where people sought change, although there was rarely specific language or specific indicators highlighted, were the words locally led design were used repeatedly, and frequently with some expansion on that around, problem identification should be from the local organisation or community. The design should be led locally by the community. The fact that the Australian NGO at some point shall exit should be explicit and designed in from that initial point in terms of program sustainability and clarity on that relationship. What local monitoring and not just ANGO accountability to local communities, but the community's ownership of that process. So certainly that from the design, monitoring, evaluation, that program cycle, it was seen that changes were needed throughout that. And this was an area where you can see that comment around the code must be aspirational. Even of the largest INGOs of whom this may be a change, there are also many of the agencies that globally are signed up to some of the key initiatives to advance this. So this is about the code reinforcing that priority. You'll see on the right there that there are a range of external references. These are each either commitments or frameworks or strategies or reports that speak to ways in which people are pursuing locally led development and humanitarian action. And they also propose some of the indicators to that. So the humanitarian advisory group reports, which have often related to some of the Pacific humanitarian response projects, either in evaluation or in consultation specifically around what locally led development looks like for the Pacific, and the NEAR framework, both are significantly aligned. There's, I think one puts it as 6 different indicators and one puts it as 7 different indicators, but it's largely we draw a line between some of the language. And so there are some existing resources, and there's also the ACFID localization framework, which is being finalized. There are a number of existing pieces to guide what might be done on some of those areas, but this is an area while some requests are clear, because it will impact commitments, indicators and verifiers, this is an area where through the COP and other consultation mechanisms, there's probably going to need to be greater testing with all members to ensure that that the balance is right on achieving some of those design principles that we've outlined. But the feedback was overwhelming in terms of not just the priority on this, but people highlighting throughout the code ways, this wasn't just talking about one commitment, one indicator. This was a permeating theme of people's comments, even on completely unrelated questions within the discussion paper. For diversity, anti-racism and racial justice, there was a sense that the code somewhat incentivises or supports pursuing diversity, anti-racism and racial justice. But most respondents were also uncertain as to whether there were any ways in which the code prevented or hindered pursuit of these. Overall, there was a sense a little bit like climate. These things are important to us, but we don't make it explicit. Is there a place where a bit similar to referencing climate change alongside environmental sustainability, we could make those explicit? So there's a proposition around inclusion of that within Quality Principle 1 around rights, protection and inclusion. There was a sense that for some small agencies, becoming too prescriptive on the mix of, for example, management, leadership, governance, you know, particularly when people, there are some genuinely almost, you know, what in a business sense would be a micro enterprise. There are some very small members where almost the maths may not work in trying to get to representation. So some of those may, if the principle is applicable to all members, it may be that some of those need to perhaps be good practice indicators, or that we find another way of making an equivalent commitment. It was certainly explicit that this needed to consider both in Australia, though, and in country and programmatic work. And so this is where the programmatic elements more fitted with the localization feedback and recommendations, whereas the in Australia elements more related to either governance or people and culture. Certainly there was a desire to, again, in terms of making things explicit, making sure that, for example, accountability and complaints mechanisms explicitly encompassed concerns in relation to racial equity, for example, within those. There was also the, I guess, the caution on ensuring, you know, the awareness of intersectionality at all times, of the diversity within diversity. So this was the area where, of the three, this received the least specific propositions, or at least the least specific propositions that differed in any way from those that had also come through from localization. We did share the slide earlier around some of the other emerging issues, but I guess as reflected then, there was that sense of no, climate, localization and anti-racism were the three key focal topics. You didn't see something that was being proposed as an equivalently sized concern for the code review to address at this point. And then, as also mentioned previously, but not shared on the slide, safeguarding was the other area where there was a significant amount of comment, and we also did include a consultation session specifically with the safeguarding community of practice. So we explored, while it wasn't explicit in the discussion paper, we explored many of the same questions, such as, does the code incentivize effective safeguarding? Are there any ways in which it prevents or inhibits? Exploring those same questions around, is there the ability to simplify or better align requirements? There are certainly some areas where there is a greater alignment from members with how the code has been structured, and a preference for the code's articulation or structuring of requirements. So it certainly wasn't an area where people's recommendation was just to adopt DFAT's approach instead, that the logic and the intent in the code still retains the support of the members. But there was a sense that beyond just mapping the code and DFAT requirements, making sure there's also consideration of others that people are aligned with, and the external reference that people most wanted to see drawn upon was from the core humanitarian standards and the development of the index that's been completed there. I'll hand over to, I assume, Emily. I'm back to yourself, just to maybe summarise next steps before we leave it open for any final questions.
Sure. Thanks, Julianne. Thanks, Andrew, as well. It's quite a lot to take in. I appreciate in this forum as well. So just firstly to say that we would welcome if you do have any thoughts or other questions that come up after this session, please feel free to get in touch via email. And as I said at the start, this is the first of another sort of series and round of conversations to test our thinking and to think about what those next steps might be. So in the next month or two, we will be doing a bit more of this proposition testing with some of the key stakeholders, the reference group, various governance committees as well, and opening it up for members as well to have a think through in this time. The purpose of this, or where we're hoping to get to by sort of early mid-December, is that we would have a series of recommendations about how to move forward. In the period after that, starting early next year, obviously things kind of slow down a little bit over the holiday period, but we would start to look at actually drafting up some of the changes that Andrew and Julianne have talked us through today. So this will be done in consultation, as always, with the COPs, members, yourselves, and with the various groups that we've been engaging with, including with DFAT. As we talked a little bit about today, you know, one of the key questions we're thinking about through the review is that alignment with some of the other external standards. And as some of you will know, there is an opportunity at the moment to sort of have some of those conversations with DFAT around their accreditation refresh that they're doing out of the ANCP evaluation. So we're certainly looking at ways to engage with them sooner rather than later on some of those questions that we talked about earlier on as well. So we will be doing kind of a first round of drafting. Then there's some sort of approval processes as well that will take those drafted changes to the CCC and board, and then further drafting post any amendments, etc. So there is quite a lot of time still for us to work on any changes. As you might have seen, there's obviously some changes that might be more straightforward than others. As Julianne mentioned, it's likely, you know, around issues on localization, we'll be having quite a few more conversations about that and what that might look like. So I encourage you to get involved as you see those come up. And if you're ever unsure what's happening or how you can be involved, please just get in touch as well using the code email address. But Julianne, if you can flick, I think there's one more. So this is just to give you a sense of where we're at in the whole process and kind of where we're looking to in the future. So at the moment, November sort of still in that consultation phase, but moving towards starting to draft up some of the changes as well. And again, looking ahead to having any approvals or any changes to the code reviewed and approved at ACFID Council next year, so in a year's time. So that's I guess all I wanted to say in terms of process. There's the email address, but again, really appreciate your time today and your thought in thinking through some of these issues as well. And we will certainly be in touch with further opportunities that are coming up to engage with us on this process. So thank you to Julianne and Andrew as well, but we'll leave it just open now in case there are any final questions or comments from the team or anyone on the call.